I have been asked, on 3 separate occasions now, to write an official account of the Ket incident for the Frontier Correctional Authority's operational archive. Each time I have started, and each time I have stopped somewhere around the third paragraph, because the third paragraph is always where I have to explain that a Hegemony war beast with a confirmed kill count somewhere north of 400 sat down in my holding pen and refused to leave, and I cannot seem to write that sentence in a way that makes the authority sound good, or the Hegemony, or anyone really, except possibly the beast. So this is the unofficial version. I am writing it for myself, because I am 58 years old and my knees hurt and I have 18 years of frontier corrections behind me, and I would like, before I retire, to have at least one story written down the way it actually happened. My name is Dav Oren. I am, or was, until the reassignment, the senior penkeeper at Frontier Station Korath 6, which is a correctional processing installation orbiting a moon that nobody has ever named because nobody wants to claim it. The moon is gray-brown and approximately the shape of a boot, if the boot had been stepped on badly. The station is 3 levels, 2 of them functional, and houses between 60 and 400 detainees at any given time, depending on what the Hegemony's border patrol has been doing lately. My job for 18 years was to keep the detainees alive, fed, and sufficiently calm that they did not injure each other or the staff between their intake processing and their eventual transfer to whatever formal facility the authority decided they belonged in. It is not a glamorous post. The pay is modest. The smell in the lower pens is something I have largely made my peace with. The Hegemony sends its penkeepers to Korath 6 when they want someone experienced enough not to panic and unimportant enough not to reassign to somewhere better. I am aware that I am that kind of person. I have always been aware of it. It has never bothered me much. The Varakhs I knew by reputation. Every penkeeper in the Frontier Service knows the Varakhs by reputation, because the reputation of the Varakh is the kind that gets told to new keepers on their first shift, as a way of establishing what the word dangerous actually means at the upper end of its range. They are native to a cluster of worlds near the Hegemony's old expansion rim, and the Hegemony spent roughly 60 years trying to domesticate them before acknowledging that domestication was not quite the right frame. What the Hegemony eventually achieved, after those 60 years, after considerable loss of life and equipment, after 3 research stations were decommissioned for structural reasons that had more to do with claws than with age, was a form of conditional cooperation. A Varakh will work with a military handler under certain conditions. The conditions are not documented anywhere in a form that is fully understood, because the Varakh decides what the conditions are, and the Varakh has not, to anyone's knowledge, chosen to explain them. What is documented is the result. A Varakh in the field is a siege engine that breathes. They stand roughly 4 meters at the shoulder, mass somewhere between 2 and 3 tons depending on the individual, and run on 6 limbs that look too heavy and move too fast. The neural spine crown along their skull and upper neck is the tell. The spines read the beast's mood more clearly than its face does. And a Varakh with its spines fully raised is a Varakh that has decided to reduce whatever is in front of it to its component materials. The armored scaling along their flanks will turn a standard-issue pulse round without registering it. The front pair of limbs end in something that is technically a hand, 4 fingers, retractable claw sheaths, enough fine motor control to unlatch a standard door or pick up an object smaller than a coin. And this is, frankly, the detail that I find most unsettling, because it means the Varakh knows how doors work and simply chooses, most of the time, not to use that knowledge. The Hegemony's official designation for their Varakh units is Voluntary Compliance Protocol Assets. This is the kind of name that a committee produces when it is trying very hard not to use the word weapon. I have always found it faintly admirable that someone, somewhere in the Hegemony's administrative apparatus, looked at a 4-ton armored Predator with a 400 confirmed kill record, and decided the thing to do was name it after a form that you sign. I had seen Varakh twice before the incident. Once at a distance of approximately 200 meters, during a transfer convoy that passed through Korath 6 outer dock on its way somewhere else, and the beast had been in a transport cage that I subsequently learned cost more than the station's annual maintenance budget. Once in a Hegemony training archive video that our facility safety officer made mandatory viewing after an incident with a Drekari detainee who had tested the lower pen's containment mesh with a piece of sharpened meal tray. The video was 40 minutes long, and I watched 11 of them before I understood what the safety officer was trying to convey, which was simply, there are worse things than a Drekari with a meal tray. So I knew what Varakhs were. I knew their size, their speed, their kill count, their official designation. I knew that the spines going flat was a good sign, and the spines going fully raised was a very bad sign, and that in between those two states, there was a range of intermediate spine positions that reportedly meant things if you knew how to read them, and that almost no one knew how to read them. None of that particularly prepared me for Commander Varakh's visit, but I am not certain anything would have. He arrived on a standard Hegemony patrol cutter, which docked at Korath 6 Outer Bay at 3:40 station time. So, the middle of the night by any reasonable measure, which is when Hegemony fleet officers prefer to arrive at installations like mine, because arriving at 3:40 gives them the psychological advantage of finding staff bleary and wrong-footed. I was not wrong-footed because I am a light sleeper, and I had been awake since 200 with one of the lower pen's Vrelian detainees, going through some kind of molt-related distress that required hourly checks. By the time Commander Varakh's aide came to inform me that the commander required my presence in the outer receiving bay, I had already had 2 cups of the station's terrible caf, and I had written up the Vrelian's overnight chart, and I was, if I am honest, slightly irritated. Varakh was everything the Hegemony produces when it puts someone through officer training, and then gives them enough rank to stop correcting them. He was tall, armored in the formal fleet shell that Hegemony officers wear for demonstrations of authority, and he had the particular posture of a man who has not heard the word no in some years, and is no longer entirely sure what it sounds like. His aides were 3, in matching armor, and they arranged themselves behind him with the precision of people who practice arranging themselves. Penkeeper Oren. He said my name the way people say the names of things they've had to look up. You are the senior keeper of this installation. I told him I was. Korath 6 is currently housing 411 detainees. He said this as though I might not have noticed, 40 of whom are listed as high risk. I am here to facilitate a resolution to that situation. I told him that was interesting, and asked what kind of resolution he had in mind. He told me, not all of it at once. He had a briefing aide who handled the details, but the shape of it was clear enough within the first few minutes. There was a situation, not on Korath 6 specifically, but in the broader frontier zone, a situation involving detainee networks and smuggling infrastructure that the Hegemony wanted disrupted, and which disruption required, the commander believed, a demonstration of consequence. The 40 high-risk detainees in my lower pens were, in the commander's assessment, linked to that infrastructure. He wanted confessions, cooperation, and specific names. He had brought, to facilitate this, a voluntary compliance protocol asset. I looked at him for a moment. I have, over 18 years, developed a particular look for moments like this. It is not hostile. It is not confrontational. It is the look of a man who has seen enough of whatever is happening to have some questions about it, but who is reserving judgment until the full picture is available. A Varakh, I said. A voluntary compliance protocol asset, he said. Yes. You're planning to put it in my holding pens. The presence of the asset in the facility will encourage cooperation. He said this with complete confidence, The way a man says things he has said in briefing rooms to people who nod. The detainees will understand what the assets deployment signifies. I asked him if he had considered what the detainees would do when they understood what the assets deployment signified, given that I was currently responsible for 411 of them, and my staff consisted of 7 keepers and a medic. He told me that was why he'd brought the asset. I thought about this. I thought about the lower pen's containment ratings, which were sufficient for Drekari with meal trays and Vrelians in molt, and the occasional Gavi separatist with strong opinions about the food, but which had not been designed with a 4-ton armored predator in mind. I thought about my 7 keepers and my medic. I thought about the Vrelian downstairs, who was already having a difficult enough week. Then I thought about the fact that Commander Varakh had a fleet cutter and formal authorization codes, and was going to do what he had decided to do regardless of what I thought, and that the only variable I actually controlled was how this next hour went for me personally. "Where's the crate?" I said. He looked slightly surprised. I think he'd expected more discussion. "In the outer bay, my handlers will." "I'll take it from the outer bay," I said. "Your handlers will wait here." His posture shifted not much, but enough. "The asset requires trained." "I know what the asset requires," I said, which was not entirely true, but was true enough that I was comfortable saying it. "Your handlers stay here. I'll bring it down." I have thought about that decision many times in the months since. I cannot tell you precisely why I made it. There was some practical reasoning. A Hegemony military handler bringing a Varakh into a holding pen facility full of panicking detainees was a recipe for a situation that would be nobody's problem to clean up because nobody would be left to do the cleaning. But there was also something else, something I find harder to articulate. 18 years of pen-keeping teaches you certain things about how animals and people, the distinction being less clean than most will admit, respond to being walked into an unfamiliar space. They read the first presence they encounter. They take a temperature from it. If the first thing they encounter is afraid or aggressive, that reading sets the register for everything that follows. I am not afraid of much at this point in my life, and I was not afraid that morning because I was still primarily irritated about being woken up before 400. I thought, in some half-formed way, that this might matter. The crate was a Hegemony military transit cage, standard issue for large asset transport, and it was attached to a loading sled in the outer bay, and it was, by my estimate, approximately 4 meters long and 2.5 meters high. The outer bay smelled of engine wash and cold dock metal. It was quiet, because it was 400, and because Commander Varakh and his aides were still in the receiving bay where I had left them. The crate had a remote release panel and a manual override. I used the manual override because I have never trusted remote release panels on equipment I didn't install myself. The panel required a key chip that the handling aide had given me before I left, and I slotted it, and the crate's front face separated with a pneumatic hiss. The inside of the crate was dark. The outside of the crate was cold dock metal. The Varakh inside the crate was, in the first second, just a shape in the dark, something large, something that breathed, something with eyes that caught the dock lighting in a way that made them look briefly lit from inside. I stood there and it looked at me, and I looked at it, and I didn't say anything because I wasn't sure what to say, and I have never believed in talking for the sake of talking. Then the neural spines moved, not raised, not threat position. They shifted in a way that was hard to describe precisely, like a muscle settling rather than tensing, and the shape in the dark moved forward. It came out of the crate slowly. Not cautiously, that's not quite the right word, because cautious implies some uncertainty about the situation, and it did not look uncertain. Deliberately. It came out the way something comes out of a space when it has decided to come out, and it was larger outside the crate than it had seemed inside, which is not how things usually work, but it filled the dock differently than the crate had led me to expect. All 6 limbs landed on the deck plating with a sound that I felt through the soles of my boots. The neural spines settled further along the crown and upper neck, flattening in sections from front to back like a wave traveling the wrong direction. It walked to me. Not at me, there is a distinction, and I felt it clearly, which is the kind of thing that is difficult to explain to someone who wasn't there, but is very easy to understand when you are. It walked to where I was standing and it put its head, which was larger than my torso, to be precise about the geometry, against my chest. I did not fall over, which I am still mildly proud of. The weight of it was considerable. Not crushing, it was not pressing, exactly, more settling, the way a large animal leans into contact when it has decided contact is acceptable. The scales along the skull were hard under my palm but not cold, warmer than the dock air by a significant margin, and textured in a way that was almost like overlapping tiles, each one individually mobile if you pressed against the grain. I pressed against the grain without really deciding to, because my hand was already there, and my hand has 18 years of working out how animals prefer to be touched. The spines along the crown went flat, not partially, entirely flat, laid back along the skull, the tips just visible past the line of the jaw. I scratched behind the crown, along the base of the first spine row where the skin between the scales was softer, because that is usually where something wants to be scratched when it leans its head against you, and also because I was running on 2 cups of terrible calf and 18 years of habit, and I didn't have a better plan. It made a sound, low, resonant, conducted through the skull into my sternum as much as heard through the air. Not a snarl, not a vocalization I had a name for. It was approximately the sound a very large thing makes when it has decided to stay where it is. I stood there in the dock in the cold and the quiet and scratched behind the crown of a 4-ton Hegemony war beast, and I thought, well, this is going to be a long morning. I was understating. Getting Ket, I gave it the name later, because I needed something to put in the pen records, and the Hegemony designation was a number-letter combination that I found insulting for reasons I cannot fully defend. Getting Ket through the outer bay and down the access corridor to the holding level was a process that took approximately 40 minutes and produced, in the people we passed along the way, reactions that ranged from pressing flat against the wall to making sounds I have not heard adult humans make outside of emergency medical contexts. My keeper on night shift that first night was a woman named Preth Calloway, who was 41 years old and had been on the Frontier Correction Circuit for 12 years, and who I have always regarded as the steadiest person on my staff. I turned a corridor junction and came face to face with Preth, who was carrying a meal delivery cart for the early morning Vrelian feed cycle, and Preth looked at Ket and Ket looked at Preth, and Preth said, very quietly, "Dav, what in the name of every dead star is that?" I told her it was a voluntary compliance protocol asset. Preth thought about this. "Is it ours now?" she said. "I'm working on it," I said. "Does it eat anything on the standard provisioning sheet?" I said I didn't know yet. "I'll find out," she said, and stepped back to let us pass, and then went back to the Vrelian's feed cart, because Preth Calloway is that kind of person. Commander Varakh met me at the holding level access door. He had come down from the receiving bay, presumably because I had been gone for 40 minutes and nobody had heard any of the emergency alerts that 40 minutes with a Varakh might reasonably have been expected to produce. He was flanked by his aides, and he was wearing the expression of someone who is revising his understanding of a situation and does not enjoy the process. He looked at Ket. Ket had its head at my shoulder level, which required a certain lowering of the skull that was, from the outside, probably readable as some kind of submissive posture, though I don't think that was quite what was happening. I think Ket was walking where I was walking, and my shoulder was the most convenient point of reference. "It came out of the crate," the commander said. This was a statement of fact delivered in the tone of a question. "Yes," I said. Without the handlers. Yes. He looked at me. He looked at Ket. He looked at the flat neural spines. The spines, I noticed, were not flat in the commander's direction. They were not raised either, not threat-raised, but they were not what I would call relaxed. They were somewhere in the middle range, the positions that reportedly meant things if you knew how to read them, and I was beginning to develop a hypothesis about what they meant, which was approximately, I have noted you, and I have not made up my mind about you. The asset is meant to be deployed in the holding pens, Varakh said. I understand that, I said. The asset came with me instead. I'll report that to your handlers if you'd like. I would like the asset to proceed with its assigned objective. I looked at Ket. Ket had turned its head to look at the commander, the neural spines in that intermediate position. I don't think the asset is interested in its assigned objective at the moment, I said. If you'd like to give it a different instruction, you're welcome to try. I'll wait here. The commander did not try. He left, eventually, with his aides, saying that he would be in contact with the authority's administrative office regarding the conduct of this deployment, and that there would be a formal review of the operational outcomes. He said this with the confidence of a man who is used to formal reviews producing the outcomes he wants. I wished him a good morning, and I meant it, and I brought Ket the rest of the way down to the holding level, and tried to figure out what to do with a Varakh who had apparently decided I was worth sitting next to. What I did, in the end, was practical. The holding level had an intake bay, a large receiving space used for processing new detainees before they went into individual pens, that was not currently in use. It was large enough. The flooring was reinforced. I put Ket in the intake bay with the door open, because closing the door felt presumptuous, and I got the station's environmental systems to bring the temperature up 10 degrees because I did not know Ket's thermal preferences, and warmer seemed like a safer guess than colder, and I went to find Preth Calloway to ask about the provisioning. Preth had already looked it up. Varakhs, it turned out, were not on the standard provisioning sheet, but the standard provisioning sheet had a notes field for non-standard dietary requirements, and Preth had found a Hegemony wildlife management document from 30 years ago that listed protein requirements for a subadult Varakh in terms of mass equivalent that she had translated into our storage inventory. We had approximately 4 days of suitable protein if we were creative about it. Preth had already ordered resupply and flagged it as an emergency medical requirement, which was not precisely accurate, but was the code most likely to produce a fast response from the authorities' logistics arm. Thank you, I said. Is it going to stay? She said. I don't know, I said. But if it does, we should know how to feed it. I'll add it to the intake paperwork, she said. I stared at her. For the census, she said. If it's in the facility, it's in the census. I thought about this and decided Preth was right. She usually is. That was day 1. Day 2, Commander Varakh sent a handler team. 2 Hegemony military handlers, certified for Varakh management, in full tactical armor, carrying the kind of equipment that is technically called behavioral redirection tools, and that is, in practice, very large and very painful. They came down the access corridor with official authorization codes and a transfer order with the commander's seal. Ket heard them before I did. I know this because I was in the intake bay with Ket at the time. I had been spending a portion of each shift there, in part to monitor and in part because, if I'm honest, the intake bay was the calmest place on the station, and the spines went through a sequence of positions that I was beginning to understand. The first position was the alert posture, spines at about 45 degrees, the head orienting toward whatever had produced the input. The second position, which happened about 30 seconds later when the handlers came through the door, was something I had not seen before and did not have a name for. Spines at full extension but angled outward rather than straight up, fanned slightly, which I subsequently decided was what a Varakh looks like when it is considering something rather than committing to it. The handlers stopped at the door. I do not think they had expected to find a Varakh with its full spine array deployed, and a penkeeper sitting on an equipment crate about 3 feet from it, reading a maintenance report. I put the report down. "Morning," I said. The lead handler looked at Ket. He looked at me. "We're here for the asset," he said. He had the voice of a professional, careful and neutral, which I respected. "I know," I said. "Does the asset know?" The handler looked at Ket again. "We have a behavioral redirection." "I can see that," I said. "I'm asking if the asset knows you're here to take it somewhere. Because in my experience, telling something where it's going before you try to move it produces better results than not telling it." There was a pause. "The asset doesn't," he started. Ket chose this moment to stand up from the floor where it had been resting, all 6 limbs unfolding in sequence, the full 4 meters of it filling the intake bay in a way that made the space feel considerably smaller than it had. The spines went a full extension, straight up, every one of them, and the front limbs' claw sheaths slid out without any particular emphasis, the way you might flex a hand that's been still too long. The handlers left. I don't blame them. The behavioral redirection tools went with them. Day 3. Varakh sent a different kind of order. This one went to the authorities' administrative office and contained several large words about operational compliance and asset recovery, and the legal status of hegemony military equipment in frontier correctional facilities. The administrative office sent it to me with a note asking me to please resolve the situation. I wrote back explaining that I was attempting to resolve the situation, and that the situation's willingness to be resolved was the limiting factor. The administrative office sent back a note that said, "Keep us informed." Day 4, Ket got out of the intake bay. Not through the door, through the ventilation maintenance corridor on the upper side of the bay, which had a panel rated for environments that did not include 4-ton armored predators, and which consequently did not survive the encounter with any dignity. Ket emerged into the main corridor of the holding level at approximately 700, which is when the day shift keepers are doing their morning welfare checks, and spent the next 3 hours walking around the holding level at what I can only describe as a touring pace, looking into the pens through the containment mesh, with the kind of calm, unhurried attention that a person pays to a museum exhibit they've paid to see. The detainees were, to put it mildly, not comfortable with this development. The noise on the lower pens reached a level I had not previously encountered in 18 years, a composite of species-specific alarm vocalizations that I suspect could be heard in the outer bay. I have a recording of it somewhere. I have not listened to it since. The keepers evacuated to the upper level and monitored via the pen cameras, which was the correct call. Ket did not attempt to enter any of the pens. The containment mesh would not have stopped it. I was very aware of this, but it didn't try. It moved through the corridor with the neural spines, in a position I now recognized as the intermediate considering something posture. And it looked, and it moved on, and eventually it found the corridor junction that led back toward the intake bay, and it went back through the ventilation maintenance corridor, which it had apparently decided was its preferred entrance, and settled back down on the intake bay floor. The high-risk detainees' cooperative responses went from 8% to 63% between that morning and the following afternoon. I did not report this to Commander Varakh. He hadn't asked me about cooperative responses, and I hadn't volunteered the information, and I was not certain my report would be received in the spirit in which it was offered. What I did report was the ventilation panel, because I needed it replaced, and the maintenance request had to go through the authority's infrastructure account, and the infrastructure account required an incident category code. I filed it under unscheduled environmental modification, which is technically accurate. Days 5 through 9 were, by the standards of what had preceded them, relatively quiet. Ket had apparently made its assessment of the facility and decided the intake bay suited it, with the exception of the twice-daily walk through the holding-level corridors that it had established as a routine on day 4, and that I had stopped trying to prevent because my options for preventing it were limited, and the detainees, I noticed, were now quieter during the walk than before it. Something about Ket's presence, once the initial alarm period passed, seemed to produce a kind of stillness in the pens. Not calm exactly, but stillness. The corridor walks had a specific quality to them that I observed more carefully as the days went on. Ket did not hurry. That was the first thing. The pace was measured, the kind of pace that belongs to something that is not worried about anything in its environment, and therefore has no reason to move faster than it wants to. The 6 limbs moved in a sequence that was almost rhythmic, a rolling gait that distributed the mass without any of the impact I'd expected from something that heavy. And along the corridor on each side, the detainees in the pens would go still. Not freeze. Stillness and freezing are different. Freezing is what prey does when it spots danger. Stillness is what everything does when it registers that something at the top of the chain is passing through and has not decided to do anything about it yet. The Drekari, who are not easy to impress and who had been the most vocal about their objections to everything since intake, stopped their objections when Ket was in the corridor. The Gavi separatists, who had organized themselves into what I can only describe as a protest formation against the pen mesh on the first 3 days, dispersed to the back of their pen every morning and evening for the duration of Ket's circuit, and did not reform until several minutes after it had passed. The Vrelian, who was still managing the molt complications, pressed itself small into the bedding and made no sound at all, which was the quietest that particular individual had been since arrival, and which I noted in the welfare log as significant reduction in stress vocalizations, cause under observation. Preth said it was because Ket was very obviously the apex thing in the room and everything else on the holding level had registered that fact and adjusted accordingly. I thought she was probably right. Preth usually is. I spent the quiet days doing the things I always did: welfare checks, paperwork, the Vrelian's molt support schedule, the bi-weekly inventory. I also spent time in the intake bay, more than I could strictly justify operationally. I told myself it was monitoring. It was partly monitoring. Mostly I found that the intake bay, with Ket in it, was the quietest place on the station, and I am at an age where I have developed opinions about quiet. There is a thing that happens in pen-keeping work that most people outside of it don't know about, which is that you develop, over time, a fine-grained ability to read the difference between contained and calm. Contained means the barriers are holding, and the individual inside is present and accounted for. Calm means something different. It means the interior state matches the exterior situation, that something isn't spending its hours looking for the gap in the wire or calculating what would need to happen for the circumstances to change. Most of what you hold in a frontier correctional facility is contained and not calm. You manage around that. You build routines and minimize stressors, and you check the mesh every shift, and you watch for the warning signs that contained is about to become something else. You don't often get to just sit in a room with something that is genuinely, fully at rest. Ket was at rest in the intake bay. Not resigned. I want to be precise about this, because resigned and at rest look similar from the outside and are very different from the inside. Resigned is what something looks like when it has run the calculations and decided that nothing is going to change and has stopped spending energy on the hope that it might. At rest is what something looks like when it is where it wants to be and the situation is acceptable. Ket, in the intake bay, was at rest. The spine positions were the main tell, fully flat, evenly distributed along the crown and neck. None of the small asymmetric tensions that I'd started to read as processing or alerting. The breathing was deep and regular. The front limbs, when resting, would arrange themselves in a loose symmetry, claw sheaths retracted, the fingers slightly curled on the deck plating. I watched all of this and I thought, this animal has spent a significant portion of its life in transport cages and active deployment, and it is resting now because it has decided this is a place where resting is safe. I did not know how to feel about that exactly. Something between satisfaction and a kind of quiet responsibility. Ket, it turned out, was moderately interested in what I was doing when I was doing it. Not invasively, it didn't try to participate. But if I was in the bay reading a report, Ket would orient toward me and watch, the spines in the settled flat position, with an attention that I found, after a few days, comfortable rather than unnerving. It reminded me of the way certain large animals at sanctuary facilities will track a keeper they've accepted. Not with demand, not with anxiety, just with the specific calm attention of a creature that has decided you are part of its world, and is therefore interested in what you're doing in it. On day 7, it picked up a tool I'd set down, a calibration wrench from the environmental panel check I was doing, and held it in the front limb hand for about 30 seconds, examining it with what I can only describe as professional interest, turning it in the four-fingered grip, pressing the head of the wrench against one scale tip with what seemed like a deliberate test of the material. Then it set it back down on the equipment crate, precisely where I'd put it. The fingers opened, the wrench settled, and the limb withdrew. I said thank you. The spines did a small motion I had not catalogued yet. Brief, contained, running from the front of the crown rearward in a single smooth pass, like a thought crossing a face. I decided it was the equivalent of a nod and proceeded accordingly. I made a note in the bay log. Tool return behavior observed appears intentional. I did not know what I was going to do with that note. It seemed worth writing. On day 9, Preth found me in the bay and told me that we had a formal communication incoming from Hegemony Fleet Command's Administrative Division regarding the operational status of the Voluntary Compliance Protocol asset currently in our facility, and that the communication was addressed to the station's senior keeper and copied to the authority's Frontier Zone Director, and that the Frontier Zone Director's office had already called twice wanting to know what in the broad span of the Frontier Zone was going on at Koreth 6. I said I would handle it. Preth looked at Ket, who was resting on the floor with the spines flat and one front limb extended, the claw sheaths retracted, looking approximately like 4 tons of armored predator having a moderately relaxed afternoon. The director's aide said the words extraordinary circumstances, Preth said. They're not wrong, I said. They also said the words full review. Also not wrong, I said. Preth considered this. Dav, she said, is the Varakh going to be here long term? I don't know, I said, which was honest. I genuinely didn't know. I knew that Ket had not shown any sign of wanting to leave, and I knew that every attempt to remove it had produced a response that made removal impractical, and I knew that the hegemony was building toward another attempt. I did not know what that attempt would look like. Because, Preth said, if it is, we should talk about the provisioning schedule. We're going through the protein stores faster than I anticipated. How much faster? About 40%. I looked at Ket. Ket had shifted slightly, front limbs rearranging with the slow deliberateness of something that is not in a hurry. The spines were still flat. Put in another order, I said. Flag it the same way. Already done, she said. I also found a supplementary care document from a Hegemony research station from 40 years ago that has some information about enrichment activities for captive Varakhs. I looked at her. Apparently, they're significantly calmer with a problem-solving component to their environment, she said. The document recommends mechanical puzzles with food rewards. We don't have mechanical puzzles, I said. I took apart one of the decommissioned intake processing terminals, she said. The interface panel has 17 interactive components. I've reset it as a reward dispensing puzzle. It's on the crate near the east wall. I looked at the east wall. The decommissioned panel was there, reassembled in a way that made it look slightly different than I remembered, with a shallow tray at the bottom and what appeared to be a small pile of the high-protein provisions in the tray. Ket, I noticed, was also looking at the east wall. "How long has that been there?" I said. "Since this morning," Preth said. "It solved 3 of the 17 components before I came to find you." I did not know what to say to this. I am not often at a loss for things to say, even inadequate things, but this particular piece of information sat on top of everything else I was managing, and I simply looked at it for a moment without speaking. "Go handle the communications," Preth said. "I'll check the provisions tray." The communications took the better part of 2 days. The Hegemony's administrative division wanted a full incident report, which I wrote. The authority's Frontier Zone director wanted a call, which I took. The director was a woman named Varakh, who had spent her career managing frontier correctional facilities with the slightly exhausted pragmatism of someone who has heard most things and is no longer surprised by the ones she hasn't heard, but who was finding the current situation a test of that pragmatism. She asked me to explain in plain terms what was happening. I explained. I told her about the crate and the dock and the head against my chest and the spine positions and the intake bay and the twice-daily corridor walks and the ventilation panel and the 63% cooperative response rate and the decommissioned interface terminal that Preth had turned into a puzzle. Director Varakh was quiet for a moment after I finished. "The detainees are cooperating more," she said. "Significantly," I said. "Because of the Varakh. Because the Varakh walks through the corridor twice a day, and they've recalibrated their understanding of where they are on the threat register," I said, broadly. "And the Varakh is currently solving puzzles. 14 of 17 components as of this morning," I said. "Preth resets it after each solve and adds 1 additional challenge component." Another pause. "Penkeeper Oren," the director said, "what exactly is your relationship with this animal?" I thought about how to answer that. "It considers me pack," I said finally. "I think. I'm not certain that's the exact terminology for what a Varakh does, but it's the closest frame I have." "And does it," she paused, "does it know you're not a Varakh?" "Yes," I said. "I think that's the point." Director Varakh made the sound of a person reassessing a situation. It was not a short sound. "The Hegemony is going to want it back," she said. "I know," I said. "What's your assessment of that process?" "I think it will go the way the first 2 attempts went," I said. "The handlers and the equipment will leave without the Varakh." "And Commander Varakh?" I had been wondering about Commander Varakh. I had not heard from him directly since the 2nd day, which I did not take as a sign that he had lost interest. Men like Varakh do not lose interest. They acquire larger authorizations. "I expect he'll come in person," I said. He did. He came on day 19, and he came with a full fleet authorization and 2 additional handlers and a Hegemony military behaviorist whose specialty was large predator compliance, and who had, according to his credentials, worked with Varakh units for 11 years. He also came with a senior aide and a recording officer, which told me that he intended this visit to be documented, presumably because he expected it to go differently than the previous ones and wanted the outcome on record. He requested the use of the outer transport pad, which was the largest open space in the station's exterior, and I granted it because he had the authorization and refusing it would have produced a different kind of problem. He arranged his people and his equipment on the pad with the efficiency of someone who has run this kind of operation before, and he sent an aide to inform me that the assets retrieval would proceed in 30 minutes, and that my presence on the pad during retrieval was not required but would be noted. I thought about this for a while. Then I went to the intake bay and I looked at Ket, who was working on the puzzle, 17 components, all reset. Preth had been resetting it every morning, and it was taking Ket slightly longer each time because Preth kept adding complexity to the interface interactions. And I said, There are people on the outer pad who want to take you somewhere. Ket stopped working on the puzzle. The spines shifted from the considering something position to the flat position. I am not telling you what to do, I said. I'm telling you what's happening. The spine stayed flat. I went to the outer pad. The commander was there with his handlers and his behaviorist and his aide and his recording officer. And the pad was equipped with a new transit cage and two pieces of equipment that I did not recognize, and that looked considerably more sophisticated than behavioral redirection tools. The behaviorist was a tall individual with 11 years of credentials and the careful posture of someone who knows exactly what they're dealing with and has a plan for it. He gave me a professional nod when I arrived. "Penkeeper Oren," Commander Varakh said. His tone was the tone of a man who has obtained sufficient authorization to be confident about the outcome. "I appreciate your attendance. As per Fleet Command Authorization 7740 Bravo, the Voluntary Compliance Protocol asset designated VCAT 14 is to be returned to active Hegemony military service effective this retrieval. I trust you've been informed." "I have," I said. "Good." He looked at the door behind me, which led back into the station. "Please have your keepers direct the asset to the outer pad." "My keepers aren't directing the asset anywhere," I said. "The asset goes where it chooses to go." His jaw moved in a way that was not quite a clench. "The behaviorist will handle the approach protocol." The outer door opened. Ket came through it. I don't know what I expected. I suppose I expected, if I expected anything, which I'm not certain I did, because 18 years of this work has largely trained out of me the habit of expecting specific things. I expected Ket to come through the door and stand near me and do something that fell in the range of its previously established behaviors. The spine positions, the orientation, the flat or considering gradient that I had been learning to read. What Ket did was come through the door and cross the pad, all 6 limbs on the deck plating, each step felt in the bones, and walk past me and walk past the 2 handlers and walk past the behaviorist and walk past Commander Varakh and walk to the transit cage and look at it. The neural spines in the intermediate considering position. Then Ket sat down on top of it. Not inside it, on top of it. All 6 limbs arranged around the cage's frame, the mass of Ket's body, 2 tons minimum, possibly more, settled onto the cage with a sound that I can describe as definitive. The cage's structural integrity, I noticed, had not survived this gracefully. The frame members had deflected. The locking mechanisms were no longer quite aligned. The cage was not going to close, and even if it had, it was not going to transport anything. The pad was silent for a moment. I was looking at Ket. Ket was looking at the commander. The neural spines, I noted, were in a position I had not seen clearly before this moment. Not raised, not flat. Something between those states and also different from them, fully extended but spread slightly outward and angled downward, like a fan unfurling toward the ground. It was, I thought, the position of something that has reached a conclusion. The behaviorist was the first person to find his voice. "That's," he said, and stopped and started again. "That's a submission posture," he said. "The downward angled spines. I've only seen it documented. It's," he stopped again. "What is it?" one of the aides said. "It's what a Varakh does," the behaviorist said slowly, like someone working out a translation in real time, "when it's decided something is pack superior. Something that outranks it in the hierarchy." He looked at me. He looked at Ket. He looked back at me. "They don't," he stopped. "I've worked with Varakh units for 11 years, and I have never seen a Varakh present a submission posture to a non-Varakh." Commander Varakh looked at me. I didn't say anything. I am a believer in the power of not saying anything when not saying anything is the more truthful option. "Penkeeper Oren," the commander said. His voice had changed. Not much, but enough. The certainty had left it, not completely, but in the way that air leaves a room when a window opens. "What exactly have you done with my asset?" I looked at Ket. Ket was still looking at the commander, the spines fanned downward and outward. The mass of it settled on the collapsed transit cage with a permanence that was not aggressive and was not passive. It was simply there. It had decided to be there. Nothing about that decision had been made with the commander's preferences in mind. I fed it, I said. I kept it warm. I had my penkeeper build it a puzzle. The commander's jaw did the not quite clench thing again. That's not. And I talked to it, I said. Mostly I just talked to it. I don't know if that's what did it, but that's what I did. There was a silence on the outer pad. The commander looked at the collapsed transit cage. He looked at Ket on top of it. He looked at the recording officer, who had been recording this entire exchange, and who had the expression of someone who is recording something, and is not certain whether this will be good or bad for him personally. The transport, the commander said finally to his aide. The aide looked at the collapsed cage. The aide looked at Ket, who was on what remained of the collapsed cage and who had not moved and showed no sign of intending to move. Commander, the transport. The other transport, the commander said. My personal transport. The aide hesitated. Sir, that vehicle is. I'm aware, the commander said. His voice was very controlled. Have it brought around. He had a personal transport on the outer pad. A smaller vehicle, a command shuttle, fleet class. The kind a commander of his rank uses to move between installations with appropriate speed and visible authority. It came around on its repulsors from the bay slot where it had been docked. It settled to the pad. Its running lights were on, a neat row of them along the lower hull, and they lit the pad in a mild gold color in the pre-dawn dark. Ket stood up from the collapsed transit cage. The full 6 limbs unfolded, the spine array shifting, and for one moment the pad felt very small. Ket walked to the commander's personal transport and sat down in front of it. Not on it, in front of it. The front limbs on the deck plating, the hindquarters down, the head level with the shuttle's cockpit viewport, the spines settled to the flat position, the claw sheaths retracted. It looked, if I am honest, like an extremely large and extremely armored version of an animal that has decided this is where it's going to be and has no urgent concerns about anything. The commander looked at his transport for a long moment. He looked at Ket. He looked at me. I stood there on the outer pad in the pre-dawn with 18 years of frontier correction behind me and a Varakh war beast sitting between me and the commander's transport, and I didn't say a word. I had nothing to add. The situation had made its own statement. I have always believed that, given sufficient time, most situations do. I will be filing a formal report, the commander said. I expected that, I said. This is not concluded, Penkeeper Oren. I'm sure it isn't, I said. He left, his handlers left. His behaviorist left, and he looked back at Ket once before he cleared the door, with the expression of someone who has spent 11 years knowing a thing and has just found out something additional about it that is going to take a while to integrate. The recording officer left. The aide left. The commander's personal transport sat on the pad, Ket in front of it, until the commander and his staff were well clear of the facility. And then Ket stood up and walked past me back through the outer door and down the corridor toward the intake bay. I stood on the pad for a while in the pre-dawn quiet. The commander left on the station's courtesy shuttle, which is a vehicle we maintain for official visitors. It seats 6, if they're willing to sit close, and it is not fleet class by any measure, and I'm told the ride back to the cutter was approximately 40 minutes. I heard later, through the authority's administrative network, which has a longer memory than most people account for, that the formal report was filed, and that it contained 340 words about my conduct and approximately 1,100 words about the behaviorist's documentation of the submission posture, and what it implied for the existing hegemony literature on Varakh social hierarchy and non-Varakh interaction. The behaviorist, I understand, has since published a paper. I have not read it. I have been told that it references Ket as a case study and refers to me, with appropriate anonymization, as the handler, and that the paper's conclusion section contains a sentence that runs roughly: the conditions under which a Varakh extends pack superior recognition to a non-Varakh remain incompletely characterized. But the Koreth 6 case suggests that neither combat demonstration nor specialized training is a prerequisite. The relevant variable may be something considerably simpler and, as a result, considerably harder to replicate by design. I thought about that sentence for a while when someone read it to me. I thought about what I had done, which was not complicated. I had opened the crate myself. I had not brought anyone else's agenda into the dock with me. I had scratched behind the crown. I had talked, not to manage or to instruct, just because Ket was there and talking seemed like the honest thing to do. I had asked Preth to build it a puzzle, because something that will spend time in your facility deserves something to think about. I had not tried to make it into what someone else needed it to be. That is, I think, all it was, or most of it. The formal outcome of the Ket incident, as documented by the authority. Frontier Station Koreth 6 detainee cooperative response rate increased from 8% to 71% during the period of the incident. No detainee was harmed. No staff member was harmed. 2 transit cages and 1 behavioral redirection tool were submitted as damaged equipment, cause listed as asset-related structural stress. The Hegemony's formal claim to the voluntary compliance protocol asset was withdrawn after a legal review that I was not a party to, and that concluded, apparently, that the asset's demonstrated preference constituted a complicating factor in the recovery claim. The Varakh stayed. It is still here. I am, as I said, preparing to retire, and the question of what happens to Ket after I leave is one that I have raised with Director Varakh twice, and that she has declined to answer directly, which I take to mean that she has not yet figured out a satisfactory answer and is managing me in the interim. I understand. It is a genuinely difficult administrative question. Preth Calloway has offered to take over primary care. She has told me, without any particular ceremony, that she has known for some time that Ket recognizes her as a secondary pack member, and that the submission posture, while not as pronounced as the one the behaviorist cataloged in the incident with Commander Varakh, has been displayed in her direction on 3 separate occasions, most recently last week, when she brought the new puzzle configuration that involves a fluid dispensing mechanism she built from the decommissioned water recycling valve array. I told her I thought she'd do fine. I go to the intake bay every morning still, before anything else. Ket is usually awake, or close to it, lying on the floor of the bay in the settled low resting posture with the spines flat and the claw sheaths in. I bring the calf. The station's calf is still terrible. This has not improved, and I sit on the equipment crate and I read the overnight logs, and Ket watches me with the calm attention of something that has decided I am part of its world and is interested in what I'm doing in it. Some mornings I talk, not about anything in particular, the maintenance schedule, the Vrelian's molt progression, whatever report is open on my tablet. Ket listens. The spines stay flat. Sometimes the front limb that is nearest to me shifts, the claw sheaths retracted, the scaled fingers arranged on the floor in a way that is near enough to my boot that I can feel the warmth of it through the material. I have 18 years of pen keeping behind me. I have learned in those 18 years that the things worth learning in this work are rarely the things you expected to learn when you started. I expected to learn protocols and containment ratings and species dietary requirements. I learned those. I also learned when to open a crate yourself, when to scratch behind the crown, when the most useful thing you can do is sit there and not need anything from the room. I don't know if Commander Varakh ever understood what happened on that outer pad. I don't know if he understood it when he left on the courtesy shuttle, or if he understood it later, when the behaviorist filed the paper, or if he has simply filed it in the category of things that the frontier produces that don't fit the existing framework and are easier to leave there. I don't need him to understand it. The record is what it is. The cooperative response rate is what it is. The transit cage, the good one, the expensive one, is in the equipment surplus log as decommissioned, and the reason code I used was operational weight excess. I thought that was accurate. Ket, this morning, solved the fluid dispensing puzzle in 4 minutes and 12 seconds. Preth has reset it with an additional locking mechanism and a secondary dispenser that requires a two-limb coordination sequence. I watched Ket examine the new configuration for about 30 seconds, the spines in the considering position, the front limbs arranged, and I thought about what the behaviorist had written. The relevant variable may be something considerably simpler. I think that's right. I think it is considerably simpler. I think that if you want something that has been built for one purpose and assigned to another and transported in a box to a cold dock at 4 in the morning, if you want that thing to trust you, the answer is not equipment or credentials or authorization codes. The answer is that you open the crate yourself, and you don't bring anyone else's agenda in with you, and you scratch behind the crown, and you build it something to think about, and you talk to it like it's worth talking to, and you wait. Most things, given enough of the right kind of attention, will decide you're worth sitting next to. That's the whole of what I know. 18 years in one Varakh, and that's the whole of it. The calf this morning was still terrible. Ket watched me drink it anyway. The spines were flat. Some mornings that's all you need.